Islamophobia and white supremacy, right? These are two very critical and problematic aspects of our contemporary society in the U.S. and, of course, around the world. And how are they intertwined, right? How do we face them? What do we think about them? How can we move to resolve some of the problematic aspects of them? And so this is really going to be fascinating, the talk and the discussion today. So let me introduce our special speaker, Dr. Salman Sayyid. He's a professor of decolonial thought and social theory and the former head of the School of Sociology and Public Policy at the University of Leeds. His work explores historical ontologies and political theories. He is recognized as a leading scholar in critical Muslim studies and the founder and editor of the interdisciplinary journal Reorient. Sayyid's major publications include Recalling the Caliphate, Decolonization and the World Order, A Fundamental Fear, Eurocentrism and the Emergence of Islamism, and the co-edited volumes Thinking Through Islamophobia, Global Perspectives, and a Post-Colonial People, South Asians in Britain. His work has been translated into over half a dozen languages. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Salman Sayyid.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. And I also would like to thank the departments of Anthropology, Sociology, Religion and Jewish Studies, the Center for Civic Engagement, Hofstra Cultural Center, and of course, my friend and colleague, Santiago, for making this possible. So what I want to talk about briefly, really, is the juxtaposition of two things, Islamophobia and white supremacy. And I think the first question might be, well, what is Islamophobia, and what has it got to do with white supremacy? And I'm going to try and answer that, but in relation to this, I want us to try and think about the way in which the work that we do as people working in the universities or students working in the universities, how that turns upon the relationship between what's happening in the world and the work we do. So in other words, this is also an exploration about the relationship between knowledge and the world, or knowledge and power, put it that way. So let's start with a simple way of thinking about white supremacy. And here I think this is a quote, comes from Charles Mills in his Racial Contract, where he says, white supremacy is the unnamed political system that has made the modern world what it is today. And this seems like a very straightforward kind of definition, but also a very different one than how people may think about white supremacy in their everyday life and existence. Because often you would think about white supremacy linked to particular kind of patterns of behavior, particular ways of having to navigate institutions and individual interactions around this concept of white supremacy. But when he says it's the unnamed political system, he's actually telling us something about how white supremacy came to be the means by which the world that we know today has been organized. And it is unnamed because it's so natural. It's unnamed because we take it for granted. And this is not just with white supremacy, but with any concept or any way of thinking. If we take it for granted, we're no longer aware that it has a history. We think it's always been the case. And part of any kind of academic work, whether it's as a student or as a researcher, is to try and tell the history of how we came to be where we are today. And that changes over time. So we take the world as we experience it as to be natural as to be normal, as to be conventional. It doesn't require us to think about it because we think that's the way things are. But the challenge that we face is in relation to understanding that the way things are now were not necessarily the way things were before, and the way things were before were not necessarily going to tell us how things were going to be now. In other words, there is the work of analysis, which is a work of history, which is a work of uncovering how things came to be natural. So let me try and give you an example of this through something very, very mundane. All of you managed to navigate coming into the theater and sitting down with a lot of prompting about where you should be sitting, and you were able to do this. You kind of know how the theater works, the layout, you know how the chairs work, etc., and you sat on chairs. So far, no one has tried to stand on a chair. This may come later, but no one did that. Because in a way you've already been used to, this is what happens when you're in a theater, this is how you behave in an academic setting, this is how you conduct yourself. And it's almost natural. You're not even thinking about it. You just do it. Though, if you can drive, the same thing. If you drive, once you learn how to drive, you may stop thinking about what you're actually doing when you're driving. You may be talking, you may be listening to music, you may be doing other things. It just becomes invisible to you. You don't even think about what you're doing, you just do it. So in that way, when things become so naturalized, we just think they are normal. This doesn't require any particular reflection and doesn't require us to think any differently about how we behave. To give you another example, the fact that perhaps almost half or more of you are females in universities, and no one thinks this is odd. However, about 30, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, there were many, many issues about whether women should be able to do undergraduate studies, never mind research studies. And that was an issue. So many things which are now we take for granted may have at previous points been something to contest, and now we just don't think there's anything to contest about them. However, there remain things which are still being contested, and there may be things that which were taken for granted once, but now again become points of struggle. So let's just think about how we can make white supremacy visible. Because one of the issues is this: if it was an unnamed system, when Charles Mills calls it white supremacy, what is he doing? He's giving it a name. And in that very act of giving it a name, he is stopping it being unnamed and invisible. He's drawing attention to it. He's saying, here is something which affects us all. It is the way the world is made. So he is actually carrying out a denaturalization. Giving something a name like that is the work of a critical concept which denaturalizes the world, and we suddenly see what it's like. So when we have concepts like white supremacy or racism, and I will go on to Islamophobia, we are actually trying to denaturalize certain patterns of inequalities, certain patterns of cruelty, certain patterns of way that things have always been done. So giving a concept a name is drawing attention to something that needs to be fixed. So if you take nothing away from today, take this thing. Concepts have work to do. Concepts are tools for something or another. They help us not only think, but they help us understand our place in the world. And a lot of the work that we do is actually work around concepts. Either we are trying to make them, polish them, use them. We have no other way of working through the world except through these concepts. But sometimes those concepts become so naturalized that we have forgotten the moment that they became into being. So now I want us to turn a little bit to talk about Islamophobia. And I want to suggest the first thing is that Islamophobia is a type of racism. Well, one response will be, how can it be a type of racism? Because Islam is a religion, and there are many, many Muslims who come from many races. But the reason why I would say Islam is a type of racism is because the idea of race itself is a manifestation of racism. The normal way in which people often tell, outside the academy, the story of racism is something like this. The world is divided into distinct races, and because those races don't get along, we have racism. What I would be suggesting here is that in fact racism comes first. It divides the human populations into distinct groups. It gives those groups distinct attributes. Over time, those attributes may change or not, but it is a system of classification. But it's not just a system of classification. Ultimately, it's a system of regulation. So if you think of racism not simply as attitudes and feelings that you may have in your head, hopefully not you, but other people may have, you miss out the point that the most important thing about racism is how it regulates and disciplines people into its classification system. And you can see this in many, many different ways. So in other words, what you have in racism is not the existence of races, but the process of racialization, making something into a category that you can see, that you can define, and you can determine how it is. And part of it is how it teaches you to see particular ways of racial organization. To give you another example of this is after 9/11, on the 12th of September, the first person killed as a retaliation for 9/11 was not a Muslim. It was actually a Sikh man, Balbir Singh Sodhi, who was killed by a white supremacist who assumed that because he had a beard and he wore a turban, he was a Muslim. This leads to the second part of the definition that I want to talk about, and that Islamophobia is a type of racism that targets not Muslims, but Muslimness. And this is important because what you're looking, when you talk about Muslimness rather than Muslim, you're talking about a range of things which may at any one time be associated with Muslims, but it doesn't mean they have to be Muslims. So for example, if you look at the genocide in Gaza, you will see that many of the Palestinians are not Muslim, many of them are Christian, many of them may be atheist. That isn't what's important. The way it is described through is a category of Muslimness that actually encompasses all of those involved in that as being targeted through genocide, for example. So what you have is no longer the stability of saying this person is a Muslim or not a Muslim. You simply have the notion of a certain kind of Muslimness that floats. At certain points, Muslimness was associated with, under the Spanish, when Spain conquered the Muslim territories in Andalusia, they thought that if you bathed too much, that was a sign of being a Muslim, because there was a restriction on how much you would bathe, etc. And you can associate every kind of racist discourse that exists. It associates certain things with certain attributes, attaches to certain people, etc. That's the kind of vernacular way in which racism exists. It attaches these things to certain groupings. In that way, so when we talk about Islamophobia, we're no longer talking about a question of, because that's not relevant in a way. We're talking about the way in which Muslimness is being targeted. Okay, so in a way what you have with Muslimness is the process of racialization. It can be done by how people are clothed, how the names they take, the food they eat, where they live, etc. It could be many, many different kind of flexible markers. Now, what has happened over this period is that you've had, I would argue, a kind of, and this is just experiences of various incidents or activities associated with Islamophobia occurring at different points of the world. So take, for example, the Great Replacement theory. This is the idea that Muslims will basically lead to a demographic explosion in which they will become a majority. So in a country like the Czech Republic, which has a population of 10 million and only about maybe 10,000 Muslims, there are politicians who argue that within 20 years it will be a majority Muslim country. Yeah? So this notion of this, and you saw that in the protests in Charlottesville, where the idea is this, that Muslims will replace the indigenous inhabitants, and again, whatever indigenous means in this kind. Or take the notion, for example, around lynchings. It is something that, again, happens now in India. It may happen in other places. And you will start noticing that some of these things are not exclusive to Islamophobia. Many of these things have been associated. Take, for example, terrorism. Terrorism was also a marker at one point of anti-Semitism. The argument was that Jewish anarchists were terrorist groups who were attacking European society at one point. So you have certain things which are specific, certain things which range, and what you have here is almost what I would call a family resemblance. A family resemblance is like you have a family of traits which circulate around Islamophobia. Some of them overlap with others, and some of them are very distinct. So if you think about a family in one way, is that if you have brothers or sisters or cousins or whatever, you will say that, oh, it's not that you're all identical. You're not necessarily clones. But you may have some features that you share with a sibling, other features you may share with one parent, not another, and you will see that, you can say, oh, they have eyes like their mother, but their hands are more like their father, or vice versa, right? So you have a range of things that tell you that there's a resemblance, but not just one thing that goes through everything else. So what you have in this kind of Islamophobic matrix is a range of things which happen, not exclusively, but what makes Islamophobia a critical expression of white supremacy, remember the idea of white supremacy is an unnamed political system, is how they become gathered and collected from others to focus on the question of Muslimness. Now within that, so you can go from, Islamophobia can go from microaggressions, and again, there are many different ways of experiencing microaggressions, to genocide, and again, there are many instances of genocide. Right? So it fools all these kinds of range of things, but once you start putting them together, you create almost a family of traits that you can pick any of these boxes, and it will lead to a way of thinking about how Islamophobia currently operates. Islamophobia then can be distinguished, like other forms of racism, between what are called hot Islamophobia, and those are the things that are basically based around attacks on persons. Islamophobia is unique among discriminatory practices, or almost unique, that the majority of the attacks in person are actually against women, especially women, mainly women wearing the hijab. So women who are wearing the hijab, who may be spat on, have the hijab ripped off, may be attacked in other ways. It may also be attacks on property. So, for example, this graffiti on the Islamic Center of America. Right? Now, again, it is an interesting thing, because one of the argument here is the idea of go home. Now, as many of you will know, that the Muslim presence in the Americas is actually is old as the country itself. It's actually older than the country, because one of the first rebellion of the enslaved in Hispaniola was mainly carried out by Muslims who had been enslaved. 30 to 50% of those who were enslaved were Muslims. But the idea that they should go home already suggests that there's a notion of Muslimness being external to a particular place. So you're kind of all familiar with these, and I don't want to spend too much time on this notion of hot Islamophobia. The one that I really would like to talk a little bit more about is the idea of a cold Islamophobia. And that is the Islamophobia that occurs through institutions. If you go through airport security now, there is a way in which airport security has been trained to pay special attention to particular types of individuals who are marked by their Muslimness. The people who are doing this may themselves be Muslim. They may be. That's not the issue. It's the same way that you can have law enforcement agencies who work structurally in particular ways, even though they may have individuals from those minoritized communities. So one of the things about cold Islamophobia is the focus that we need to think about is the institutional and structural aspects of discriminatory practices. Firstly, they are very, very pernicious because often you may not be aware of them. So imagine you're applying for a job and you get rejected. How would you know that the rejection for the application is due to the fact that you didn't meet the criteria, or because there was something else? Whether you were identified by your name, whether you were identified by your the address that you gave from where you come from. You would not necessarily know this as an individual. However, you could work out, if you did an analysis, that actually here is this firm which over a number of years has never employed more than 1% of people of color. But those 1% will not necessarily know this is the reason. So in that sense, the institutional analysis is necessary because institutions endure. They produce outcomes which are problematic and detrimental to well-being, but often the way that they work is difficult to see as individuals. You cannot see whether you are being treated unfairly unless you have a comparator. And most of the time, most people do not have comparators like that. You go through life and hoping that you will be treated well, and if you're not treated well, you think, okay, well, maybe I wasn't good enough or whatever. Something needs to happen to show you, actually, the reason why this outcome didn't happen isn't due just to your individual failings, but it's actually something systemic. Now that, I think, is a really important element that I want to try and talk about as a key thing. This ability to see has two components to it. The first one we've already talked about a little bit is the notion of concepts. Concepts allow you to see. Why is it that people from identified by their names or particular neighborhoods do not get employment in this particular firm? To give you an example, right? You would need a way of explaining that. Normally how explanations are done is by making some kind of random excuse that, they weren't qualified, etc. Let me give you a real-life example of this. The murder of George Floyd could have been interpreted as basically look, this man was killed, it's terrible, but these things happen. That's the first excuse. Or you could say this happened, but it was a work of a few bad apples. That here we have there's 4 or 5 police officers who basically were the wrong kind of people that did something bad. Or you could have a notion that this is due to a particularly corrupt police department. Each of these steps require you to understand why something happened. Now, what was interesting about the George Floyd murder, because there have been many, many African-American men who've been killed by the police, is why it led to, not only in the United States, but throughout the world, major mobilizations. People came together because they understood the murder of one individual in Minnesota was part of a structural effect of the way in which colonialism, racism, and enslavement operated even today. That's why you have the murder of someone in Minnesota, and then you have statues of enslavers in England and in Belgium being desecrated or destroyed, because they were able to see that link. But how could you see that link isn't automatic. And that's the work of both of concepts and mobilization. That you say, actually, what is happening to you today, or what is happening to this group of people, is not just to do with them, it's to do with the way in which you have a particular system which organizes that. In other words, that unnamed political system has to be named for you to understand why these things occur. And in that unnaming, you take the first steps towards improving things, making things better. So without that, it is impossible to make things better. So if we accept that concepts appear to do work, what I'd like to just spend a little bit of time is look at the concepts that I've talked about and see when they start appearing. Often you hear in the literature, and you may come across, that Islamophobia is a very recent concept. It only emerged in 1997, or it only emerged after 9/11, etc. But what you see is not the emergence of specifically just words, because you can have a list. You can see the first time something called Musliman phobia, which is the way they used to talk about Muslim, used to be Musliman, right? You can see how it appears in 1857, almost 3 years before anti-Semitism as a concept emerges, which is invented, or popularized at least, by an anti-Semite. Yeah? And then you can see in 1904, Islamophobia appears in Italian, in Egypt. And funnily enough, the concept that does most of the work right now is racism, but that only appeared in 1934 in Germany by what we would call now a gay activist, who used the word to describe what the Nazis were doing in 1930s in Germany. Now, what the Nazis were doing in 1930s in Germany was not that different from what the French, the Dutch, the English were doing in their empires. It wasn't that different from what was happening in the United States. In fact, as you probably know, many of those Nazis had conferences with organizations like the Carnegie Endowment, etc., to discuss how to implement Jim Crow in Europe. And many of the critics of Nazism, like people like Hofstra, pointed out that what was actually the horror of Nazism was that it brought imperialism, colonialism inside Europe, in the heart of Europe. That's what made it distinctive. So what you have is the emergence of a concept in 1934 to describe what is already happening in the rest of the world. And my argument would be, well, why do you need a new concept when everything you're describing in 1930s Germany is exactly what is happening in the rest of the world under European rule? the reason I would suggest to you is that the concept of racism allows you to preserve a difference between the West and the rest. And this means that you think of racism as something that happens inside countries, and you think of colonialism that happens outside countries, and you maintain the idea that the Western countries, Western societies are places which are not subject to the same kind of logic, same kind of violence that you see in other countries, in other places. But the most important work done against white supremacy was when anti-colonialism and anti-racism came together. You can see this most famously in the example of the Black Panthers, who saw their struggle as an anti-colonial and an anti-racist struggle. You can see this by the example of Martin Luther King, who was told by Johnson, stop criticizing our policies in Vietnam. If you do that, you'll undermine. We are giving you what you want, but you're criticizing about Vietnam. You should have no concern about what's happening in Vietnam or what is happening outside. There's a famous thing about Muhammad Ali refusing to actually go to Vietnam because he argued that he had no quarrel with the Vietnamese. They were not doing him any harm, whereas he saw the same struggle between anti-racism and anti-colonialism. So at that moment, when you have anti-colonialism and anti-racism combined, this is when white supremacy suffered the most of its defeats. Subsequently, when you separate anti-racism and anti-colonialism, you actually weaken the critique of white supremacy, because you say, well, anti-racism is something that happens, we need to deal with it, it's an internal problem, it has no linkages with external problems. Now, what is interesting is that part of that anti-racist narrative allowed us to think that, in fact, we were living in a post-racial world, that we have the prospect of significant positions of power, authority, prestige, and influence being occupied by people who had been completely marginalized. And therefore, we kind of had moved away from a world organized around race to a better world. What we have in Islamophobia is a post-racial form of racism, because what it concedes is that, look, we are not basing this on what we used to think were racist before, but we're doing nearly the same thing, but we're doing it through the category of Muslimness rather than through the concept of race. And we are building similar kinds of systems of inequality, institutions, and protocols which marginalize and intimidate and subjugate populations. Now, these populations, we may say, initially start off being focused around Muslimness, but once we start introducing particular kinds of legislation, and particular kinds of frameworks, they will have an effect on everybody. Most of the legislation around, for example, countering violent extremism in Europe, started off by saying we need to do something about terrorism from radical Muslim groups, which they were unable to define. And then it became, well, we need to do something about people protesting against ecological climate emergency. And then it became about, well, we need to protest against people who are not happy with the choices that the legislators are making. So in a way, you start off by saying, and this is not unusual, that what we are doing is only affecting a minority. What you end up doing is using the same kind of framework to extend and weaken those civil rights for everyone. To give you a final example of this, in about a few years ago, they introduced, one part of the anti-terror legislation was the ability for the government to take away children from parents who they considered to be radical. It wasn't that children were being harmed in any way. They said they were going to take them away. Now, the record of colonial racial states taking away children is actually quite dark. They've done it in Australia, Canada, United States, etc. And then they apologized. So there were generations of children who were basically kidnapped, taken away from their parents and families, and brought up by the government. Think about that for a minute. Not because the children were in danger or any harm, but this was done. And then you will see that there was all these apologies about this is terrible, this should never happen. And what you have, again, is the same kind of logic where you have children being taken away, or even worse, parents being threatened that their children will be taken away. So you see the kind of way in which these things float and they circulate. Ultimately, what Islamophobia does, like any kind of systematic discriminatory practice, is weaken and rewrite the social contract. It makes the idea that the people have a voice, and a voice that is critical, something more and more difficult to sustain and do. And as a result, Islamophobia becomes a means in which, throughout the world, many, many different governments from many different countries, they could be liberal, they could be conservative, they could be authoritarian, they could be democratic, converge on Islamophobia as a way of rewriting the social contract, the contract between the governed and the governors, basically. Okay, so I just want to conclude with perhaps making the argument I've tried to show you is that there is a conceptual link between white supremacy and Islamophobia, that in fact they're all part. Islamophobia is simply another part of the way in which a political system working right now. I've also pointed out that part of the work we do in academia is the work of conceptual makings, and what conceptual concepts do is denaturalize what we take to be granted and natural. But saying something is constructed isn't enough. What is the next step, in a way? And what I wanted to finish with is two things. In face of discriminatory practices, what have been the ways in which the struggles have achieved some transformation? Now, one of the most epic struggles against racism, and with the most kind of global significance, is the civil rights struggle in the United States here. And it was significant for two very important reasons. One, it occurred in the United States, which was the most powerful country in the world. Two, it occurred mainly to liberate a marginalized group which had been subjugated for almost at least 300 plus years. And I think it's very, very difficult to imagine the inequality of relations of power between those two things. But I would argue that part of the civil rights, to understand the civil rights is very, very important, but to understand it, we need to break away from the romance of civil rights, in which it simply is portrayed in many, many kind of Hollywood films where everyone becomes suddenly, Martin Luther King makes a speech and everyone is moved and everyone lives happily ever after. To give you just one example, even after Martin Luther King's speech, Washington speech, which you'll notice is constantly repeated on how transformative it was, 70% of white Americans surveyed at that, just after that speech, argued that African Americans had too many rights and this was too far and civil rights should not go through. This is after. So the retrospective reconstruction that no one was actually, well, very few people would argue, we actually supported the oppression of African Americans, gets erased from that. But the civil rights movement, as I said before, was a global movement. It taught others how to resist, how to become anti-racist activists, but it also was aware of how to link the anti-racist struggle with the anti-colonial struggle. And that was really, really important because those links are not natural, they have to be done through work. So when, for example, Storky Carmichael and happened to write the book and talk about institutional racism, what they're trying to show is that, look, racism isn't just about individuals, bad individuals. It is about a system, and a system that has global reach. And therefore, the struggle for that system, against that system, has to be systemic. It can't be just the idea of finding good individual people. That's a great start, but it's not about individuals. It's about systems. So, the first thing I think we need to think about, any kind of attempt to think about both Islamophobia and white supremacy should be thought about as concepts for justice. They're there to denaturalize what we would take for granted. And they're opening the idea of a battle of ideas to shaping the common sense, to reshaping the assumptions. So take some of the gross assumptions that we may have about different groups. So what they're trying to do is inform a new etiquette, the new way that we behave with people, the new kind of way that you engage, etc. You will see that there's an elimination throughout most of the United States now of benches which will mark out people saying whites only, for example. Now, it's a big country, so there may be some, but I think they're most been eliminated. Having said that, the Confederate flag has only been removed relatively recently from there, okay? In South Africa, outside the Supreme Court, they actually keep a bench as a reminder. They have 2 benches there. If you go there, you'll see it in Cape Town. There it says white only and natives only. So that, in a sense, is how you shape that thing sounds so odd and weird for us. But ideas can't flourish without institutions. So the ideas are not in themselves enough. It's not about winning arguments. It's changing institutions through those arguments. And you need to have, as much as you want to have a proper anti-racist university, it has to be, or anti-racist institutions, then they have to be anti-Islamophobic. It can't simply be that we will have equality and diversity and inclusivity. These are great things, but they're not really anti-discriminatory per se. So really how this has to be done is by organizing, by strategizing, and this is how it's always been done, that the relationship between discriminatory practices is through political mobilization. That's how you undo them. And here I would just want to finish with a final point here, is that the most important thing that we can do in relation to Islamophobia, but I would also add white supremacy, is reject any justification or rationalization. There can never be an excuse for it. And it can never be rationalized in saying, well, somehow it's justified, whether. And we have the whole history of at least 100+ years when attempts were made to rationalize racism and discriminatory practices of crimes. So the most important thing is to reject that rationalization and reject the logic of that rationalization. And you can see this in attempts to say, well, we should talk about, instead of talking about Islamophobia, we should talk about anti-Muslim hate, etc., etc. That's a strategic mistake because you dilute the problem, because the idea of Islamophobia is to denaturalize what is happening, and if you start throwing other things in the way, you stop doing that work. So, having said all of this, the only thing that I would want to that has been made clear is that one of the main ways in which white supremacy in the world expresses itself increasingly is through Islamophobia. Not exclusively, but increasingly. And Islamophobia is a kind of post-racial form of racism that targets expressions not of just Muslims, because they can't tell who is a Muslim, not a Muslim, but Muslimness. And now that you know all of this, I have nothing more to say.
Yes. Okay, first of all, I want to thank everyone for coming this morning to join us, and especially Dr. Sayyid for actually helping us to understand not only the diagnosis of the problem, but also the potentiality of confronting it. So I'm sure many of you have a lot of questions. So I want you to start thinking a little bit about them and actually make a line here. So we have a few minutes to start asking questions. And I want to thank especially Dr. Sayyid, I was saying before, for having made his way here from the UK. He's speaking in major places such as University of Pennsylvania, Princeton, here, later Villanova, later on he's heading to Canada. So it's very, very helpful for all of us to be able to actually host you here. And as well, I want to thank the Department of Anthropology, Department of Sociology, Department of Religion, Program in Jewish Studies, Center for Civic Engagement, and the Hofstra Cultural Center for making this possible. So, people with questions, please, just come here to the front, be courageous, and we are going to start a good discussion about Islamophobia and white supremacy. So, who wants to be the first? Great. Thank you so much for being courageous to be the first. Yes, please. If you want to start thinking about the questions, and please, if you have questions, please start lining up here so we can actually gather them together.
Hello. So, brief context. Last year, I wrote a paper on the relationship between military propaganda in Hollywood and the Department of Defense and so on, focusing on post-9/11 Islamophobia in Hollywood movies. And I was wondering if unfavorable depictions counted more towards hot or cold Islamophobia, considering it is intentional, but it isn't a personal attack.
I think that's a really good, interesting question. I would say to you, there's two parts to it. There's the actual depictions, which may tend towards hot Islamophobia, but the process by which the films get made and the decision-making around how to make those kind of films, the script writing, the direction from the production team, the studio's role in that would probably fall into cold Islamophobia. So you may be aware of a Islamophobic film when you see it as a hot Islamophobia because it triggers something, but you may not be aware of the process that led to it.
So I guess one of my questions is, interfaith groups usually try to attack hatred that can happen between all religions. Do you think interfaith groups can help with Islamophobia, and how?
Okay, I think it depends. I think it's always good to have conversations with people who want to do something about, let's say, Islamophobia. I have two reservations, and they're general reservations rather than specific reservations. Firstly, I don't see Islamophobia as primarily caused by religion and religious motivations. So that's the first thing. Secondly, if you actually think about it, it's very easy to get imams and pundits and rabbis and priests in a room with each other, generally. They tend to be quite polite and they can talk to each other. But if you look at what is at the heart of Islamophobia, it's really disputes about the nature of revelation itself. That's not, so in a way, I think it's not a theological problem. So I have no feeling that people shouldn't, of different faiths shouldn't talk to each other, they shouldn't increase maybe awareness of each other, etc. But I think we need to be sort of cautious about saying that that is the only solution in a way. I think it may be a good thing in terms of raising awareness of issues, and also raising awareness that perhaps what is being presented, often theological differences, are not really about theological differences. Most Islamophobes are not au fait with theology that much, to be honest with you. In the same way that most racists are not really very literate on racism. So for that reason, I think it's good to raise awareness, but not necessarily as the only solution. And it can be a problem if it leads to or prevents us thinking about this in terms of political mobilization and collective action.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk about the origins of the concept Muslimanophobia.
Okay, so that concept emerges in 1857, and it's actually used by a civil servant in British India, who uses this to describe the attitude he sees in relation to many of his peers after 1857. So 1857, there was a major uprising in India where many soldiers, Hindu, Sikh, Muslim, rebelled against British rule, because the story goes that they were being asked to, okay, so it's slightly technical. They had to bite bullets for their guns, but the argument became that the bullets were made out of either cow fat, or the covering was made out of cow fat or pig fat, etc. So that's the kind of rationale that was given at the time. So his response was that since that 1857, there has been a great deal of hostility to Muslims, and that's what he called Muslimanophobia, rather than simply seeing this as an uprising of nearly all the colonized subjugated armies.
More questions?
Thank you so much, Salman, Professor Sayyid, for your talk. I was wondering for our students, and when you talk about the linkages between colonialism, and I wonder if you could just say a little more as to why we can't talk about colonialism and empire as much more in the context of contemporary Islamophobia. And I'm thinking, because when you give the notion of context, you talk about the Muslimanophobia, and contextualize it in history. And I'm wondering if it's useful, Gurminder Bhamra and all talk about this, whether it makes sense to talk more about empire and Islamophobia that kind of connects, rather than use the term racism. So that's one. And the second is, I'm perhaps saying it here after some, that the idea of this diversity, inclusion, equity is in a way kind of de-radicalizes our attempts at mobilization. I think in a way it normalizes, right, the role of institutions. And I wonder if you could talk a little more about that, because in the US, we've seen this for a long time, including myself, and I've become much more critical of how we're using it in institutions to kind of push for mobilization movements.
Okay, thank you. I think one of the reasons why people don't talk about colonialism is because there's a conceit that there is no more colonialism. All the countries of the world are independent, they've got their own flags, they've got their own football teams, therefore there's no colonialism existing. So that's one of our difficult arguments. I think linked with that is a way in which, and I think this is also one of the problems that we've seen, sort of what's happened to the civil rights movement as it becomes less global, is that two things happen. One, it becomes, there's a kind of concentration on focus on what I call methodological nationalism, which is that we understand social problems within the idea of a given state, a given country. And that feeds on a certain kind of provincialism and parochialism. So we don't think that these things are going on other places. So just to give you any example here, that you take something like house demolitions. Right? Now, we know that this is something that is happening in India against Muslim houses. We know this is something that's happening in Palestine, right? We know this is something that's happened previously in different places, okay? But because we see only through the prism of the nation state, we don't see the connection. Or to give you another thing, when we have police techniques in France or the United States or Britain using the same techniques that are being used in Kashmir or Palestine or the Uyghurs, there's a circulation of knowledge as tactics. You know, academics have conferences, so do securocrats, so do police officers. So in that way, but because our framing is national, we only see this as a national problem rather than seeing actually why is it that suddenly this kind of technique or this kind of chokehold emerges in so many different places at the same time. So I think that's partly our framing of that. I agree with you totally about the diversity, inclusivity agenda. I think it is there to depoliticize and to prevent change. Antonio Gramsci, a great political thinker from Italy, has this notion, what he calls a passive revolution. And one of the things I'm writing about is EDI as passive revolution. And the idea of a passive revolution is that basically you give in to the demands to prevent real transformation. It's kind of like I suppose one example, we think of it like a vaccine, that basically rather than having something different, you say, right, we will give you. So for example, one of the ways it works, rather than thinking about restoration or of rewards, you may say we give you increased representation. Now that may not be a bad thing, but it doesn't necessarily go to the heart of the systemic inequalities. So I agree totally with you about the diversity thing. Again, I think the point isn't that, oh, it's a bad thing and we should do away with it. I'm saying that, okay, it's one step, and our job, if we have a job, should be to make that, extend that, and to use that, to broaden that, to make it more radical, and to make it more committed to bringing about justice, rather than being satisfied with it. And I think that's the key that I would want to make. I would rather still be in organizations which have commitments to diversity on their brochures, maybe not in their boardrooms, but then that gives me a means of saying, well, why don't your brochures and your boardrooms align with each other? And so I think it's a step, but if that becomes the end all, then it doesn't take us anywhere.
I have a question. So one of the ways how I've seen people perpetuate Islamophobia is by using LGBTQ people as a scapegoat to being Islamophobic. How do you think we can build cohesion between these groups and best decrease Islamophobia in these spaces?
Okay. Again, this is a really good question, but what is interesting about this is there was a moment not that long ago, about 50 years ago, when the idea that there were the LGBT, what we call now the LGBTQ plus community, was something which was considered to be deviant and something considered to be external to what it meant to be a good Westerner. And this was something that practiced in other parts of the world. So you have a history of, for example, places like Tangiers or etc., where many people from the global north would go there to be themselves because they couldn't be themselves in their home countries. So I think one of the things that we need to understand is that to have a movement of justice, you do not need to have agreement on every single issue. And many of the disagreements that people may have are themselves subject of a particular kind of Islamophobia itself. So while there's no kind of magic bullet The most important thing is to actually, that the reason why we're struggling against Islamophobia is because ultimately affects all of us, because it's rewriting the social contract. And that's what we should be focusing on. You will often find that in any movement of change, you will find huge amount of differences, not only between tactics and strategy, but different people coming from different places, different occupations, etc. And in fact, this is why it's really important to learn the history of those successful movements of transformation. This is why I would go back to the centrality of the civil rights movement. Not everybody on the civil rights movement agreed with every single thing. I mean, not only just the kind of disagreement between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, which is sort of emblematic of different kind of tactics, but even within those groups in how people were arraying themselves. And the work is there, a work of education to try and bring people together to think about what the future, a better future might be for all. And that, I think, is the only thing you can do to A, recognize that all kind of political movements of transformation are going to be diverse, internally diverse and heterogeneous, and B, you need to then have a very clear idea of what your objective is and work towards that objective regardless of those internal differences. That doesn't mean you stop having those internal differences, but you still think that despite those internal differences, we will carry on working to that objective as well.
We have time for two more questions. There's one coming there.
Okay, so you said that Islamophobia is also more about like perceiving, like, you know, you see a person and you think they're Muslim because of their covering. But you can also talk about like the internal problem in Middle Eastern countries, because I feel like lately there's been like, I mean, this problem's been going on for years, but I feel like especially in social media and shows, they've been trying to like make it seem like being too Muslim is bad, or like covering yourself, you know, being more free is better. And I'll say, like, for example, in Egypt, there lately shows been showing like, oh, like, you know, show like a really ugly girl with the hijab and then she'll take it off and she's really pretty. So I feel like it's also more of an internal problem, and I feel like we should work more on fixing that problem, because it's like, you know, if it's like we're like this here, it's going to be even worse outside.
Thank you. I would say to you some of the most significant Islamophobes tend to be those who would call themselves Muslims as well. So again, Islamophobia is not about whether you are a Muslim or not, or how much of a Muslim you are not. It's actually a way of thinking and understanding the world. Many of the governments and many of the elite societies in many of these countries are incredibly Islamophobic, because part of the Islamophobia is this notion that the future is somehow westernizing, so it's a westernizing horizon, and therefore to be Western means not to be Muslim, so to remove Muslimness in there. But, and here's the issue, the reason why you have governments like in Egypt or in UAE, for example, who can do that is not because of any popular demand by their populations. They are sustained and supported by a network of associations, including other countries. If, you know, the rule of El-Sisi is made possible by the support that he gets from Washington, from Paris, from London, etc. So then you have to ask yourself, well, why is it that throughout these countries where Muslims are there, most of the governments that are favored by liberal democracies most of the time are governments which are authoritarian and against their people. And the governments, because if the people had a voice, they would want Muslimness to play a part in those arrangements. So in that sense, nearly all movements for a kind of democratization are always going to have some kind of relationship with Muslimness. And that's why many parts of the world would rather prefer to have authoritarian governments who are Islamophobic, because for them, they do not want governments which empower their people, because it makes them more difficult to control, to legalize, etc. If there were governments which were more attuned to popular opinion in what is now what you call the Middle East, then I would say that their position they were taking over in the relation to Gaza would be very, very different.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sayyid, for a really fascinating and informative lecture. I'm wondering if you can speak a bit about change and the taken for granted, the habitus, because my students in my cultural anthropology course are studying the idea of culture, and I've stressed that understanding habitus is very important. So if we think about naming these forms of inequality, right, making them conscious, entering them into discourse, that really doesn't move us towards, really changing the taken for granted, the habitus that's been instilled in them, inculcated by social structures, by the whole history of Islamophobia, racism, and so forth. So how do we approach that? How do we change that sort of instilled sort of culture?
Thank you for that very important but also very difficult question to answer. But I agree, firstly, that knowing is only the first step. And in many ways, knowing is actually the worst step, because you can live in ignorance and not have to deal with the fact that you know something is wrong. And once you know, then you lose your sleep. So that's one element of it. But I think the issue is this: the only thing we can do, ultimately, as people in universities, etc., and working with our ideas, we have a tremendous privilege here that we can learn about the past, and we can learn about what's happening in other places. In other words, we can expand the diet of examples by which we understand the world. So for me, the first and one of the most important things for us to do is to see, well, how did other people in other similar type situations or other occasions bring about change? Now, we may not, it doesn't mean that you imitate that, but that's a way of, well, they did this, and we think this might work here, but it may not work in that way. So firstly is to expand the literacies of transformation by broadening the examples by which we understand the world. So this may be a perhaps unfortunate thing to say, there is no short circuit to learning. We have to learn how things have been done. But the thing that we need to add is that change has always happened and is always possible. But it's not easy. It's never been easy. And even when they make movies about it, make it look easy, no, at that moment you do not know what will happen. So there's a certain kind of conviction and that you have to say, look, this needs to change, but I do not know how this will end up. But you still have to make that step. So part of it is that learning, and then the second part of it is teaching. And I just don't mean informally through classes, etc. As you work through anthropology and you look at the counter-anthropology of resistance. How did people resist? How did people try and transform? What are the stories that they told? What are the things that made people change the way they understood the world? And the more examples we have, the better prepared we are to think about changing the culture, because ultimately the culture is what makes us, and we are simply products of a particular kind of cultural configurations, and that's why the site of political struggle is as much as culture as anything else. So it's probably not a very helpful answer, but at least a truthful one.
One more question. Two more questions.
Hi, I was just wondering, how do you think the situation in Gaza affects the discrimination against Muslims in America?
Okay. I think it is, well, thank you first for that question. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about, and I didn't hear, is to think about Islamophobia as a kind of Palestinianization of Muslimness. And the reason I didn't want to talk about it this way is because I see Palestinianization as having two aspects to it. One aspect, which, for example, someone like David Theo Goldberg talks about racial Palestinianization, is you can see that Palestinianization means the continuation of colonial racial rule and how that is implemented and how those who are Palestinianized lose their rights, their ability to be themselves. It's a kind of a way in which if you want to know what colonialism was like, if you want to know what Jim Crow was like, then that is an example for you. If you want to know what apartheid was like, here is an example of what's happening, but this time with modern technology, with computers, etc. But it's still there, right? So that's one example of it. But there's another element of Palestinianization, which is exactly the idea of resistance to that. The resistance to this subjugation, the resistance to and refusal to be simply erased. Not necessarily physically, but that could also be the case, but erased as a people themselves which have any kind of distinct possibilities. So I think Gaza has done both things. It has erupted this notion that has made it very, very difficult for people to pretend that they do not know what is happening. We can no longer close our eyes and unsee what we are being seeing. And we then have now become complicit in that if we do not do whatever we can do in whatever circumstance we find ourselves to ameliorate the situation. So in that sense, I think Gaza shows the height of Islamophobia because it shows that the suffering of those who are tainted, and I use that word for this purpose, by Muslimness doesn't match the suffering of those untainted by Muslimness. So if you think about the way in Ukraine and the way in Gaza are treated repeatedly, not just once, twice, how the suffering in Ukraine and how the suffering of Palestinians is represented in the elite echelons of the global north, you will be struck by this kind of gaslighting. We're being gaslighted all the time. So one of the things about gaslighting, once you know you're being gaslighted, you kind of got no excuse anymore. So I think Gaza both shows that, it shows the height, but at the same time it shows a resistance to the continuation of Islamophobia. So when you have these demonstrations and when you have these camps, these are basically centers of learning, and they're centers of actually the laboratories of the future. And when you have people, to go back to the earlier question, from different faiths coming together in those moments against injustice, against Islamophobia, you have actually you're in the process of transforming the way a society thinks about a particular issue. And so I think in that way, Gaza has both shown the height of Islamophobia, but at the moment of its height, it shows also the root of its demise, at least its limitation. And that mobilization is there, but it's up to us to make that more prominent rather than less prominent.
Okay, so you cite here Great Replacement Theory, which is an extension of white nationalism, white supremacy, and so on. If we go back to 2017, Charlottesville, you have the Nazis and the tiki torches and all that. Jews will not replace us, right? Okay, so rewind about a century, you know, to the teens and the 1920s. You have Jewish immigrants to the U.S., like my grandparents, being regarded by white ethnocentrists, you know, the far right, as not being white. at least in a cultural sense. Updating that to the white centrist community today, great replacement theory, Tucker Carlson, and the rest, how would you say Jews are regarded today in terms of not being white?
Thank you. That's a really fascinating question. I mean, one of the arguments we can make is that there is a process of whitening of particular kinds of Jewishness. Not all, but others. And you can see this in the alt-right. The alt-right, there was an interview with Richard Spencer on Israeli TV, where he made the point that what he wants is basically a country like Israel, but for white people. Now, what was interesting is that the TV anchor did not pick up on what he's talking about in that relationship. But so up till from 1945 till very recently, one thing you knew about anti-Semites, they were not pro-Zionists. They were anti-Semitic, and you kind of card-carrying anti-Semites. Now you have a situation where people who are often anti-Semitic, but at the same time pro-Israeli. And that, in fact, is a very interesting kind of phenomenon. So when you look at the demonstrations that take place, Islamophobic demonstrations throughout the world, or even on January the 6th, you will see what kind of flags are being flown, okay? So, of course, you'll find the Confederate flag. Why not, right? January 6th. You then find Israeli flags, and you then find flags of the previous regime in Iran. And now you find the Indian flag. So this kind of marker tells you what's happening to the question of whiteness and what is the idea, for example, why did the expression Judo-Christian take off after 1945? It existed before, but it takes off. Nearly everything, we are part of the Judo-Christian. Now, if I had been giving this lecture, this is a kind of impossibility, but even in the 1850s, we were talking about it, the idea of if I talked about Islamophobia, and Muslimness, I would be talking about Jews as well. Because there was no difference between the idea of a Muslim and a Jew in the kind of Western imaginary. So there could be, both were considered one. In other words, Jews were not considered part of the West. They were considered to be external to it. And they were considered to be not much better or much worse than Muslims. And we have repeated studies which have demonstrated this. I mean, the work of Gill and Jar is a very good example of this. So we had a category called Semites, or its variations, which included both Jews and Muslims. Now, what's happened since then is the disarticulation of types of Jewishness away from that into this thing about, and you could see this, for example, when the idea of Israel itself is a kind of a bastion, a Western bastion in the Asian landmass. It's talked about in colonial racial terms. Herzl is very, very, if you read the Jewish State, this is what he's thinking about. And part of it, there's also passages come through there that, for example, he went to the Pope and asked that he's willing to guarantee that all Jews will convert to Catholicism if they're given their homeland, kind of thing. So you're talking about different ways of which identities are configured together. And I would say to you that that experience that you described, that trajectory, shows that at the moment there was that Jewishness was considered to be not white, and to some extent certain types of Jewishness are becoming associated with whiteness, and that partly explains the whole kind of investment in a culture, in a colonial racial experiment.
Okay, we are going to be closing. First of all, I want to thank very much all the departments and centers that sponsor this event. Please note that all these departments are offering great classes, which will be a complementation of what Dr. Sayyid presented us. As I mentioned before, Religion and Jewish Studies will be teaching Islam today and anti-Semitism, Islamophobia and racism. Anthropology has a class on cross-cultural perspectives in religion, and sociology, I think, has a class on Islamophobia, no? And other classes. Okay, so before you go, 1 second, please, before we close, please join me in a big applause for our guest.
Thank you.
And now you can enjoy the rest of your day.